Welcome to Sweden. In a span of 8 days, we lived, walked, and drove around in this beautiful nation of lakes, forests, stunning parks, charming food halls, legendary film studios, and historic Viking towns and royal palaces. It was one of the most memorable experiences, and I will treasure it forever. On our first night in Stockholm, we had dinner at the Pelican, one of the oldest restaurants in Stockholm in the southern district of Södermalm. We ordered the Arctic char and köttbullar, Swedish meatballs, and the rhubarb pie for dessert. It was a wonderful and welcoming space, and our server gave us so many tips about the area and what to see while we were in Södermalm. We took some local advice and tried some glass ice cream at Sticky Nicky. Take my word for it, Swedish ice cream is the best. Located south of Gamla, Stockholm's old town, Södermalm was one of the first areas to be settled in Stockholm. This is Medius, or Medborgarplatsen, the People's Square. As you can see, it is quite busy on a Wednesday evening. Södermalm is also known as the hipster part of the city. So many dive bars and pubs, like the Old Beef Eater Inn. We decided to trek over to one of the best viewpoints of Stockholm, Ulriksdal, which is about 25 minutes from us here in Medborgarplatsen, not counting all the elevation. Short story, we eventually arrived, Ulriksdal, a word that took me a long time to figure out, so congratulate me. Ulriksdal is the highest point in Södermalm, and a popular spot for Swedes looking for a place to take in the sunset while drinking and eating. Apparently cats like it too, but I think this little guy really just wanted to chase the birds. From this height, you'll be able to see many of Stockholm's most beautiful and landmark destinations. If you're a cinephile, you may also recognize this skyline from Ingmar Bergman's Sommaren med Monica. Trust me, I'm a huge Bergman buff, and I will not apologize for the number of times I mention him on this trip. But all that aside, Stockholm really is pretty. Welcome to Gamla, Stockholm's old town. Stockholm was founded here in the 13th century, and its old town is still the city's main draw for tourists, with its cobbled streets, opulent statues and churches, and most of all, the Royal Palace of Stockholm. Besides evolving according to every reigning monarch's taste, it can be said that the Royal Palace's process of restoration over the centuries, medieval castle to Renaissance Baroque palace, is a testament to the monarchy's longevity. The King of Sweden makes his daily commute here and I highly recommend seeing the changing of the guard and viewing the palace from every side. Learn about the sacrifices of Christina Gyllenherna and gaze into the eyes of the Medici lions. On the southern end you can find the Swedish coat of arms and a plaque honoring King Charles XII. Our visit in the palace started in the Hall of State, where the king used to open parliament every year until 1975. There is no doubt of the time and attention put into creating every room, every statue, every throne, and every hallway. Gustaf III, who restored the royal autocracy to Sweden and opened the door to religious freedom and better social mobility for everyday Swedes, was shot by his enemies in 1792 and died in this room of his wounds. Sweden was a superpower in the 17th and 18th centuries, and Charles XI's gallery reflects Sweden's ties to France. On the other end of the palace, you will come across the apartments of the House of Bernadotte, who came to power in Sweden in the beginning of the 19th century. Take your time as you walk around the portrait gallery and look into the eyes and faces of Sweden's monarchs from the 19th and 20th centuries. After completing our tour of the palace, we descended down to the Royal Armoury, which may be one of my all-time favorite museums in all of Europe, with its exhaustive collection of 40,000 artifacts from 5 centuries of Swedish royal history. Helmets from the reign of Gustaf Vasa, the coronation cloak worn by Eric XIV of Sweden, the swords, the halberds, Queen Christina's coronation mantle, a priceless trove of items from King Gustav Adolphus's life that his own wife collected for posterity. I could spend a whole day talking about each king in this room, but let's focus on one. Gustaf III's only son, Gustaf IV, lived a life full of setback. It wasn't enough that his father died when he was 14. He lost Finland in war with Russia, he was forced to abdicate and died in poverty in Switzerland. Which is my favorite piece of royal regalia, you might ask? It would have to be Karl Johan XIV's coronation suit. Just look at that silver fabric and embroidery. The final section of the museum was dedicated to the integral part Gustaf III played in developing Swedish opera. Gustaf was immensely responsible for founding the Royal Dramatic Theatre, the Royal Opera, and the Royal Swedish Academy. Inspired by French models, he even invited composers and architects from abroad to enliven the Swedish stage with color, light, beauty, and most of all, music. One of the most famous operas of his day was Gustaf Vasa, with a libretto by the poet Lundgren. The piece proved to be a huge boost in propaganda as Sweden recommenced hostilities with its oldest rival, Denmark. Gluck's Orfeo ed Eurydice also received favor from the crown, and performed in Stockholm ahead of its Paris release in 1773, 1 year into Gustavus' reign. In conclusion, despite being a tyrant, it's remarkable when you realize that Gustav's most prominent mark was never in war or atrocities, but simply music. The Stockholm Cathedral, consecrated by St. Nicholas in the year 1306, has seen much change through the years. During the Reformation in Sweden, Mass was celebrated here in Swedish for the first time. Olavus Petri, who studied under Luther in Germany, was appointed by King Gustavus Vasa in 1524 as the preacher of this cathedral. Petri was tasked with translating the New Testament into Swedish and reforming the church in Sweden into a Lutheran one. Many coronations and weddings have been held here, one of the most famous ones being between King Eric XIV of Sweden and Karin Mansdaughter in 1568. Today, visitors can revel in the altarpiece, which is inlaid with silver, the pulpit, and most of all the golden crown, held aloft by angels, clear symbols of the monarchy and its ties to the church here in Sweden. This sculpture of St. George and the Dragon serves a double purpose. First, as religious iconography, who doesn't love the story of George and the Dragon? Second, as a monument from Sten Sture the Elder to himself during the Battle of Brunkeby in 1471. It was one of the most crucial battles in the early struggles between Denmark and Sweden, where the Danes seeking to reabsorb Sweden into the Kalmar Union, and Sweden already on the path to nationhood. As we left the cathedral, we passed the palace of Axel Oxenstierna, one of the most beloved politicians in Swedish history. He served as High Chancellor for 3 Swedish monarchs, including Gustavus Adolphus, and laid the groundwork for Sweden's administration today. With our visits to the palace and cathedral completed, our tour of Gamla stan began with a visit to the headquarters of the Swedish Academy, founded by King Gustaf III, and now serving as the Nobel Prize Museum. It was exciting learning more about Alfred Nobel, the winners of all the prizes through the years, and their impact on science, literature, and world peace. Gamla stan's central square may seem peaceful today, but in 1520 it was the site of the Stockholm bloodbath, one of the most important catalysts for Denmark and Sweden's centuries-long animosity. King Christian II of Denmark slaughtered 90 Swedish aristocrats, reneging on his promises of mercy. One of these nobles was Erik Johansson. His son, Gustaf Eriksson, would go on to found the Wasa dynasty. One of the highlights of exploring Gamla stan was trying as much of the ice cream as we could find. The exception was Ben & Jerry's, which we already have in the States, although their waffles definitely look very good. Without a doubt, Gamla stan 1859 was my favorite. As a vanilla lover, I had to try their vanilla gelatos. Leave the glass, take the cannoli, they said. And of course, we had to check out some of their bakeries. These Swedish waffle cones were super. If you ever get to explore Gamla stan, make sure to go find the candy stores. Try some of these while you're here, and the other delicious treats too. My favorites are the simple but delicious sugared strawberry jellies. Gamla stan also has a very famous science fiction bookstore. Look at their section dedicated to the Lord of the Rings. And of course you'll find Pippi Longstocking in every shop window. As you reach the bottom of Gamla stan, you will pass through Kornhamnstorget. The most famous site here is the house where Descartes lived, while he was here as Queen Christina's tutor. Not for long though, since he died of pneumonia after only 4 months in Stockholm. And of course, any trip to Gamla stan will require you to walk through its narrowest street. Just keep in mind it's going to be very busy here during the summer, so get through it as quick as you can and then move on. We were planning to have dinner at the Viking restaurant Ouverture that night, so we decided to chill in the sun after all that walking until dinner. Apparently it's totally okay to just pull up a chair and sit by the lake, so totally do that if you come. Ouverture Krog and Bar is one of Gamla stan's gems. Dating back to the reign of Queen Christina, the restaurant was once a wine cellar and now treats guests to a menu of well-researched dishes going back to the Viking Age. We were able to get dinner without a reservation, but I would advise you to book ahead because this place fills up extremely quickly.
You guys down the corner there, welcome in.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
My beloved friends, I have found you a Swedish gentleman that is probably not as lovely as he looks. This one went to the United States, kidnapped 4 people and brought them back to Djürgarden.
There's really nothing bad I can say about Ouverture. The environment is lively, the music is great, and the food is wow to die for. My favorite was absolutely Ruik's feast, with the delicious root vegetables, carrots, potatoes, and mushrooms, not to mention the flap steak, lamb chop, and venison. After our tour of the royal palace, we had lunch at the cafe Sten Store. Located close to all the key attractions in Gamla, it was actually originally a monastery for nuns. Jakob Johan Ankarström, who killed Gustaf III, was imprisoned here. It will remain a prison for 100 years before it became a royal armory. It has since been a restaurant for 40 years now, and is definitely one of the best restaurants I've tried in Stockholm. I came twice because of how much I enjoyed the food, the deer ribeye in particular. Definitely check out the cell where Ankarström was imprisoned. As you can see, there's a ton of graffiti. I didn't have a Sharpie unfortunately, so I couldn't put anything down. It has been found that the facade was made in 1630 using a combination of limestone, sandstone, marble, greystone, and slate. Welcome to Ulriksdal Slott. Ulriksdal Palace is located in the Södermalm municipality and has seen a great deal of history since its establishment. Jacob de la Gardie, Constable of the Realm, was the first to reside here, and he christened it Jakobsdal. The estate gained early recognition in November of 1632 when Queen Christina enjoyed coming here and eventually chose to begin her coronation procession at this estate. In 1669, Jacob's son would permanently sell the site to the crown. The palace remained in the hands of the monarchy ever since and saw much glory, especially during the reign of Queen Louise Ulrika and Gustaf III. Between 1822 and 1849, the palace was remade into a veterans hospital. Then, in the mid-1850s, it returned to being a residence of the crown. It was Charles XV and his Queen Louise who found the palace almost completely empty and endeavored to refurnish it. The most famous item in his collection was John Paziotoxin. A freed African, John arrived in Sweden in 1860 and ended up in the king's employ. Besides cleaning Charles's pipes, he was remembered by visitors as an exotic item, often dressed in fancy clothing. But his story ends well. The king died and John received his pension in 1870. He moved to Stockholm, married a Swedish woman, had 2 children, and found work in the city alongside others of African descent. Learning Toxin's story while I was at the palace was probably my favorite experience there because it shines a light on Afro-Swedes' experience in Stockholm. The palace found new life once again in 1923. Gustaf VI Adolf and Louis Mountbatten moved into the palace with their children. The real price of admission here is the living room, the former Hall of Chivalry. Designed carefully by Carl Malmsten, the furniture includes items made mostly with local materials. A few exceptions including furniture made with cane, a material that the king liked but Malmsten didn't. To this day, this living room is one of the most well-preserved 1920s interiors in Sweden. A short walk away from the palace is Confidencen, Sweden's oldest theatre. It originally served as a riding stable before the monarchy grandly repurposed it in 1753 to perform all the latest in plays and operas. The interior stables became the theatre and the tavern a reception room. But when Gustaf III was assassinated in 1792, the budget for theatres like Confidencen was slashed. It was repurposed for other uses, but the site mainly languished in dilapidation for centuries. Things changed in the 1970s when Confidencen experienced a revival under the leadership of Swedish opera singer Kirsten Dellert. Work of restoration commenced in the 90s and it was completed in the 2000s. Music festivals are now held here every summer. We are here to see a performance on Don Giovanni. We weren't allowed to take photos during the performance, but all I can say is that it was a wonderful experience seeing a performance of one of my favorite operas on a traditional 18th century stage, with a small orchestra in Europe, not to mention with Swedish subtitles. I remember the play well enough and became a matter of combining memory and surrendering to Mozart's music. On our fourth day in Sweden, we booked a trip through Stockholm to Lake Mälaren and the island of Birka, where the Vikings used to live.
The trip up to Birka takes approximately 2 hours. We will be making a few stops along the route to pick up some more passengers.
The journey to Birka across the Lake Mälaren was like nothing we had ever experienced. I read before coming to Sweden that it has many lakes, 267,570 islands, and that the lakes formed as a result of Ice Age glaciation. But I did not expect for the lakes to look so beautiful. We saw so many beautiful houses along the shore as well. It's wonderful to see the Swedes living in such close contact to nature. Most of these islands also have history going back thousands of years, and to cap it all, they have their own origin myths. Kungshat, or King's Hat Island, for example, was named for a Viking king who owned a hat with magic powers. It allowed him to control the weather, but he would lose this hat in the water when he was attacked and pursued by a Norwegian king. The story goes that if you wave your hat as you pass by the island, then you will be blessed with good weather. Welcome to Birka. Between 750 and 975 AD, Birka stood at the center of cultural economic exchange between the Baltic, continental Europe, and the Black Sea. An average of 700 people made up the population, and they committed their lives to the manufacturing, buying and selling of goods, commodities like furs, iron and slaves, in return for luxury goods, oriental silk, coins from Arabia, swords from Francia, all objects that gave the local kings status and wealth. It was fascinating to learn that for thousands of years, the island was smaller, Much of what now exists was underwater due to post-ice age glaciation and higher water levels. There also weren't so many trees. All you could see for miles around were Birka's grave mounds.
And these burials have quite a few interpretations of them. One being that this is a communal grave. This is where you're buried if you can't afford your own burial mound. Because if you had your own burial mound, you were either quite important person for the community or you were very rich.
According to what the archaeological record tells us, the Vikings valued ancestry and familial ties, so it's not beyond reason to think that many of the people who lived here desired to be buried together, to place a physical mark on the land, and to prove that they owned it.
These are built for one person, and most burials from this time in Scandinavia are cremation burials. They burn their dead. They're not ashes as we think of cremation today, but larger parts of bones.
Individuals in Birka society who were rich enough to afford special graves could decide what to take with them to the afterlife, such as combs and beads. Birka has been an archaeological goldmine for centuries. In the 1990s, these ramparts ringing the highest hill of Birka were discovered. The walls are 350 meters in length and are comparable to the hill forts found in the rest of 5th century Scandinavia, albeit far more advanced. But there was more to be discovered.
It is thought that this is where the guard of Birka used to live. They had smiths which provides them with weapons, and above them, just a few steps away, they have the defense wall. So they can easily run up there to defend Birka in case of an invasion. And the reason why it's thought this house was where the guard lived is because there's findings of weapons in form of spears and remains of shields. And also everyday objects such as combs. But also religious memorabilia which suggests a cult devoted to the warrior. This is where you find the spear dancer. There's a small amulet that is portraying a man holding spears and forming a spear dance. This house is actually burnt down, but it's thought that it was purposely burnt down by the Vikings themselves. Because they often did that when they abandoned something.
Beginnings and endings have proven to be a central motif in Scandinavian tradition. In the same way, Ragnarök is prophesied to end with a new world with survivors called Leif and Leifthrassir. We shall see that the Vikings frequently moved from one center of power to the next.
Do anyone remember Hjalmar Stolpe, which I spoke about earlier? He opened this burial and he described it as one of the strangest sights he had seen. In this burial, a person was seated, watching the water. They were standing guard, or sitting guard, you could say. And with them, they had 2 horses, a stallion and a mare. And they had gear with them to the horses, as well as a gaming set, including boarding pieces. They also had clothing of the finest materials you could think of in Sweden during this time period. But they also had weapons, and plenty of them. They had an axe, bow and arrow, sword and shield, and before they closed the burial, they had thrown down a spear. And during this time, when this was excavated at the end of the 1800s, to estimate who was in the burial, you looked at the grave goods. So this was said to be a very, very important man of high status. and a guard or a warrior, maybe even a commander. This was called the warrior burial of the warriors. And it was fought this for over 130 years. Until a research team asked to examine the remains at the Historical Museum in Stockholm. This research team was led by a bioarchaeologist called Charlotte Hedenstierna Jonsson. And when they examined the remains, they discovered that this person died around the age of 35 to 40. And they were at least 170 centimeters tall. But it was not a man in this burial. It was a woman. This would come to change everything we know about the Viking Age and thought about warrior burials. However, when this was revealed, neither the public nor the scientific society accepted it. You'd think that this was a long time ago, but the discovery of that this person was a woman happened only 14 years ago. Today, the phenomenon of warrior women in Viking media, such as the Vikings and games and such, is very common and very happily portrayed. It's very popular. But back then, it was almost impossible to think that the Vikings had female warriors. But the Vikings themselves, they described female warriors. It's Valkyries in the mythologies and shield maidens in the sagas. So I really like to speak about this burial because it shows how critical we must be as archaeologists. Because what we see now would go through the lens of our society and not the Vikings. I will also say that often Scandinavia during this time is portrayed as a feminist paradise where women were in charge and had it easy. That is not true. It was still very hard for women, but it got worse with the arrival of Christianity. Back then, they were still in charge of the homestead and the farm, and they had the right to divorce. But it was still a rough life for women. And now we're going to continue to what you all actually came for. Welcome to Birka. Now you might wonder, where is this ancient city? Well, it's actually this field. It's where Birka used to exist.
You can see grave mounds in the distance, 1,600 in fact. On this side, Borg, there are about 800. The other burials would have continued in a horseshoe shape, connecting both of these burial sites as they circled around the city. Archaeologists have proven that about 400 houses used to exist below the Borg parapet, and you can see what life was like with the dioramas and recreations. Beginning in the year 829, Christian missionaries like Ansgar began arriving in Birka, still a flourishing market town, with the intent of spreading Christianity. Although Christianity never had a major foothold here, the winds of change slowly but surely reduced Birka's importance in the networks of trade. Prosperity in the Scandinavian world shifted from the act of exchanging luxury goods to the sale of land. Birka lost its importance as Christian cities like Sigtuna, Uppsala, and eventually Stockholm eclipsed it in economic importance. And yet, the sites of Birka remain. They teach us to always ask questions, to think big, to explore and innovate, to remember our roots, and that perhaps there really is no ending, but new beginnings.
Duggade så sakta i många tusen år. Det är en himlajord, min vän, den jorden där du står. De säger att den kommer från öknen västerpå, men ifrån himlen föll himlen, det kan du lita på. Och oceanens vindar var regnet till vår lukt. Det faller jord, jungfrulig jord, från himlen i min hand. Det faller jord, jungfrulig jord, från himlen i min hand.
We returned to Stockholm at around 5 p.m., and with sunset not due for a couple hours, I decided to walk around and explore as much as I could of the city. I'd really recommend you doing this when you come to Stockholm in the summer months, because while the museums and tourist attractions close at 5 and 6 p.m., the rest of the city starts to come to life.
Du ser väl att jag är tung nog som det är. Jag är en sån som gärna vill bestämma. Förr fick jag aldrig det. Jag har aldrig vågat göra som de säger. Ändå har jag frågat dem om råd.
It was amazing to see so many people fishing here. As you leave Gamla and cross the bridge, you arrive in Norrmalm, the city's northern boroughs and famous for its museums, theaters, department stores, shopping malls, hotels, and restaurants. Before the 1960s, Stockholm's most important public space was Bunkebergstorget. Today, you can still find Sweden's central bank here. Stockholm underwent major expansion in the 1960s, with the government implementing the miljonprogrammet in the suburbs to improve housing shortages there, while in the city, urban renewal hit an all-time high. Sergelstorget isn't exactly pretty. It's loud, it's the site of traffic jams, a Five Guys joint, everyday political demonstrations, and the occasional criminal and drug dealer. But it's the central hub of the city and definitely takes your breath away. Welcome to Kungsholmen. Once belonging to the king, Kungsholmen, or the King's Garden, would pass on to the city in 1970. Today, Stockholmers come here to hang out. Ice skating in the winter, concerts in the summer. This place has it all.
Som jag inte kan förklara, så skulle jag förstå. Det här är mitt liv, det här är mitt jobb, det här är min tid och mina val som jag har valt dem. Du behöver inte förstå det, det här är sättet som jag gör det på, och det är upp till dig.
Today, we venture back into medieval Sweden, and what better way to do that than by visiting Riddarholmen. Stockholm was originally founded in 1252 at the height of the Middle Ages. The man attributed to founding the city is Birger Jarl. Born in 1210, Birger Jarl lived a long life dedicated to Sweden. He brought war to Finland and consolidated Sweden's dominance there. He engaged in 2 significant marriages that strengthened his position in Scandinavia, and when his son Valdemar became king, Birger ruled as his regent. If that isn't enough, he gets the credit for founding Stockholm. Before becoming the Knight's Islet as it is known today, the island was named Munkholmen, Monk's Islet. The reason looms large. Riddarholmen is Stockholm's oldest church, and before becoming the final resting place of the Swedish monarchy, Riddarholmen was a Franciscan monastery. The Franciscans who settled here in 1268 built the foundations of this Gothic church out of sand and clay and consecrated the church in the year 1300. The 20 or so friars living here at any given time dedicated their lives to praying, studying, and the copying of books. This is a collection of fables written in Latin, and it was the first book to be printed here in Sweden. The survival of the church came into question when Sweden adopted Lutheranism in 1527. But the intervention of King Johann III, a monarch who sought to restore some form of peace between Lutherans and Catholics, saved the church from demolition. Riddarholmen was renovated and tombs were commissioned for 2 medieval kings. What's interesting, however, is that the effigies were carved with only contemporary interpretations of what they look like. Second, archaeologists have since discovered that the sarcophagus of King Magnus does not even contain Magnus's remains. Whatever the case, until 1950, Riddarholmen was the church where Sweden's kings and queens were laid to rest. Gustavus II Adolphus formally transformed Riddarholmen into a royal burial church, and he was the first king to be buried in Stockholm since the Middle Ages. His chapel would be completed in 1634, 2 years after he was killed in action at the Battle of Lutzen. Gustaf III, Gustaf IV, and their immediate families are buried below. This chapel was built for the current royal dynasty of Sweden, the House of Bernadotte. Karl XIV's sarcophagus is made of pale red Swedish granite, and it took 8 years alone to produce. The stained glass windows were added in 1888, and they depict national and regional coat of arms. The texts on the walls honor the deeds of Karl XIV Johann, the first monarch of the Bernadotte dynasty. Riddarholmen is a quieter place than it used to be 100 years ago, and I enjoyed coming here to learn more about the shifts in Swedish history. On the way out of Riddarholmen, I had one last ice cream, bid farewell to Sweden's illustrious ballad singer Evert Taube, and took to the streets of Norrmalm once again. This is very much downtown Stockholm, and we're not very far from Drottninggatan, where many stores are located. If it's a Sunday for you like when I visited, I'd highly recommend you drop by the Hotoriet flea market. Weekend markets and flea markets are a staple of Stockholm culture, and it's become a tradition for locals and tourists alike to come mingle on Sundays. Even if you don't end up buying anything, it's a great idea to come and soak in the atmosphere. Should you continue walking towards Drottninggatan, you'll pass the Stockholm International School and eventually the House of the People, where important conferences have been held since 1901. For example, in June 1972, the United Nations met here to discuss the best way forward to handle environmental issues. It's not surprising then why Sweden has been a leader in environmental sustainability ever since. With time left on my hands, I went to the Strindberg Museet, the museum dedicated to August Strindberg. He moved here in 1908, and it would be his last residence. The museum is located on the 4th floor of this building, and you can either walk up or take the old-fashioned elevator. Now, full disclaimer, I've never read any of Strindberg's novels, but I do know he's a national treasure in Sweden for his work in literature and theater. I recently saw an adaptation of Miss Julie by Alf Sjöberg. Now, unfortunately, the exhibit's mostly in Swedish, but they do have a great introductory film that covers his full life story. The main part of the exhibit is the 3-room suite where Strindberg lived. At that point in time, this 3-room suite was the height of modernity with electricity, bathroom, and phone. The bedroom features original furniture and reproductions of the wallpaper. The lamp by the window was Strindberg's pride and joy. On January 22, 1912, he stood on this very balcony and received a standing ovation from a crowd of 10,000 people. He died from cancer in May of the same year. It was at this desk where Strindberg wrote The Chancellor and the Great Highway, as well as a series of newspaper articles attacking the idolization of royalty, the military, and the authorities. Welcome to Östermalm. Originally a village with adjoining cowsheds and barns, Ladugårdslandet, translated as the barnland, transformed in the 1880s into what we now know as Östermalm, the eastern outer city, Stockholm's prettiest and most expensive district. Completed in the 1890s, Strandvägen is one of the prettiest and grandest of Östermalm's boulevards, and in Stockholm in general.
This is the sightseeing tour.
It was in Strandvägen 3 where Ingrid Bergman grew up. Her father also owned a photography shop here, and it was through the films and photographs he took of her that she first fell in love with cinema. Unfortunately, he passed when she was only 14. After paying our respects to Ingrid Bergman, we happened upon a bust of Raoul Wallenberg just outside the Hotel Diplomat. We didn't have time to visit Stockholm's Jewish Museum on this trip, but it was gratifying to see so many museums in Stockholm dedicated to Wallenberg, Sweden's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Budapest during World War II, where he saved thousands of Jews from the Nazis. Across the street, we had our first sight of the Hedvig Eleonora Church. A street away from Strandvägen is Vapnagatan. This may not look like a very pretty place, but it has served as the king's royal stables for over a century. Princess Madeleine and her family also have an apartment here, and you may also recognize the entrance from Ingmar Bergman's film Fanny and Alexander. Right around the corner is Dramaten. To my great disappointment, it was closed for the summer, but it was enough to stand in front of its gates. Preeminent as Sweden's national stage and epicenter of art, Dramaten was founded by Gustaf III, and its legacy is most felt in the army of actors and filmmakers who performed here, walked through its halls and trained at its academy. Ingrid Bergman, Greta Garbo, Max von Sydow, Gunnar Björnstrand, Bibi Andersson, Ingrid Tudlin, Birgitta Petersson, and Ingmar Bergman, of course, who few think of as a playwright, but worked here in the 1960s. On we go into the heart of Östermalm. This is Ingmar Bergman Platz. And this is Theatergrillen, Dramaten's premier restaurant. Ingmar Bergman was of course a regular here. It was impossible for me not to get fixated on the wall art and Latin inscriptions. Östermalm's Salo Hall is absolutely worth a visit. Opened in March of 1888, it was given a boost in business when in 1914 the city of Stockholm banned open-air markets in the square for sanitary reasons. Whether you want a coffee or ready-made food, this food hall is a great place to visit, with quality old businesses that have served Stockholm for decades. Sweden's legendary filmmaker Ingmar Bergman grew up in Östermalm, first on Villagatan 22, and then here on Storgatan. His father, Eric Bergman, was a vicar across the street at the Hedvig Eleonora Church between 1934 and 1955. In Östermalm you may find the modern Army Museum, housed in what was once Stockholm's historic artillery depot. A lot of cannons can be found in the museum courtyard, and there are more inside, like this 3-pound falconet that Charles XII of Sweden gifted the Polish ambassador in 1699. King Augustus of Poland declared war on Sweden a year later, and in the ensuing fighting, the Swedes recovered this cannon and others like it. Indeed, many of the museum's artifacts are war spoils. We may not think of it today, but Sweden was once a superpower. Between the 1600s and 1700s, the Swedish army inspired respect and fear with its warrior kings and well-trained military. Sweden's fire burned the brightest and shortest in the lifetime of Charles XII. Reigning between 1682 and 1718, Charles XII is remembered for his reforms, his victories, and most of all, his failures. Failures which modern historians argue cost Sweden her future. In the very much overlooked Great Northern War from 1700 to 1721, Charles started the war well, besieging Copenhagen into submission before defeating a Russian army at Narva. But his imprudent prosecution of the war as it followed led to Russia's ascendancy, his eventual death in battle, and the extinguishing of Sweden's expansionistic dreams. One of the most haunting exhibits in the museum is dedicated to 5,500 of Charles's men who were hit by a blizzard while on their long retreat back to Sweden. Half of them froze to death. The detritus of the once proud host was excavated from mass graves in the Swedish village of Jämtland, and they exist in the museum for us to see today. A century later, Sweden was once more at war with Russia, but this time Sweden lost and had no choice but to seize control of Finland. Sweden was significantly neutral during World War II, but that doesn't mean that they were idle either. Arms were gathered, troops mustered, and supplies stockpiled at makeshift stations all over the country. Under the indefinite state of alert, cipher machines were used to break German codes and spy on German communications. The Swedish army was placed in a state of preparedness and committed to thankless tasks like guarding forts, drilling, building trenches, and laying out barbed wire. To help relieve stress and boredom, books were distributed to the units. Meanwhile, abroad, several key ambassadors like Raoul Wallenberg aided in the protection of Jews. Var dina ord sitta, ska alla länkar bryta, blott för ett ord en kväll, som var bara en bagatell. This fancy neighborhood surrounds Karlaplan, the main park plaza here in Östermalm. August Strindberg lived in the area between 1901 and 1908. When he wasn't residing or working on the island of Fårö, Ingmar Bergman lived here in Karlaplan. He also owned an office not far from here. I went looking for the place where they shot this, but it was close to impossible to find the exact spot because of how the architecture has changed over the years. But it was definitely around this roundabout. We stopped by at a grocery shop that has been open since that era. It's just next door from the fountain. Welcome to Filmstaden. Between 1920 and 1971, Filmstaden was the capital of Swedish Hollywood. Directors like Ingmar Bergman, Moritz Stiller, Victor Sjöström, and Maj Zetterling worked here. And it was also where stars like Ingrid Bergman, Greta Garbo, and Maj Zetterling made their big breaks. It was thrilling being here in this space, where so many great films were made. The Seventh Seal, The Emigrants, and Loving Couples, for example. Bergman is one of my favorite directors of all time, and the statue here personifies Bergman's style of cinema. Film is something physical and sensory, and we can touch it in the same way we can touch these statues.
And in 1912, film was, in its beginning.
Right.
I usually say it's in the teens.
Right.
You could say it's really a young, something that is come out of technology and is very new, and you don't really know if it's what to use it for. So they got a job actually finding out how to tell stories with moving pictures.
Right.
And also how to make this film company rich.
I'd recommend booking a guided tour since the buildings are often closed. You can email ahead of time.
Swedish film industry, that's the company name that built Filmstaden.
I see.
And that existed for almost 100 years, making films in this place and also having cinemas, exactly like the companies in Hollywood.
Right.
Yeah, like MGM, Warner Brothers, and Paramount. So here we have this city that takes up about, I usually say it's about 10 football stadiums big. It's big. In the beginning, there are 10 buildings around. They started out. At the end of this era, there are about 50 buildings here.
Wow.
So what you see here is just a part of Filmstaden. When it was Swedish Hollywood, about 500 people worked here, and more than 500 films were made here during that time. Because they didn't only make feature films; they also made short films.
Right.
This is the house with the dressing rooms for the actors. This is this house. So there were 2 studios, the small and the big. And yeah, that's where you make the films. And then the rest of the buildings here are places to build sets, to store sets, and of course places to store the films. But there also, this exists today too, where I think you went up here.
Yeah, we went there yesterday.
This house existed also from 1920 and was from the beginning a restaurant.
Right.
Because, hundreds of people were going to work here.
Yeah, they need to have a good
They needed
meal.
to eat.
Yeah.
So this has been a restaurant for almost for more than 100 years. Yeah.
Right? So there are no residential houses.
No, except for the house behind you, because from the beginning, the gatekeeper's lodge was built as a place for the gatekeeper to live.
Right.
He had to stay there. This square is called Ingmar Bergman Square today, although I think it should be called Victor Sjöström Square, because at this place where we're standing is the first used sets indoors, but the idea was to use everything here. So the first set that was built here was actually a graveyard here. So we're standing in the middle of a graveyard built in 1920 for the first film by Victor Sjöström, which is, do you know it?
Phantom Carriage?
Yes, exactly. This film, The Phantom Carriage by Victor Sjöström, actually inspired Bergman very much.
Yeah.
I'll come to that later. But it's a beautiful. It's based by a story by Selma Lagerlöf, she's called. They filmed the scenes, and then of course they knocked the graveyard. They just put them away. Well, this was the Dream Factory, the big studios. Yeah. Everything was made here. It was torn down in 1999, just before the millennium. Because at that time, this place had been abandoned by the film industry for about 20 years. And it slowly began to fall apart. You could say that it's a collaborative effort also to save 8 buildings, the orange buildings, but everything else was torn down. Everything else was torn down, and this new place grew up instead.
The filmmakers who came to Filmstaden at the height of its glory prided themselves on craftsmanship, expertise, and most of all, telling human stories.
Vem är det där? Adel, en kvinna. Därför gift, därför olycklig, därför började du bli alldeles olidlig.
They were skilled. They had the tools to innovate and do things that few had the ingenuity to accomplish. They looked deep inside themselves and pulled out their darkest secrets, suffering for their art, all in the pursuit of the questions we ask. What is the meaning of it all? Why can't we escape death? Is change really inevitable? How much do we really know? Is the gap between fellow human beings so large that there's no chance for us to reconnect with our loved ones and say the things that they need to hear? Does God exist? Or is the world cold, dark, and disappointing?
Vi som trodde att den här resan skulle bli så rolig. Så blev det...
Det har varit väldigt roligt.
Det är egentligen bara mamma som får röra vid dig. Vi älskar mamma, du och jag.
They dare to critique and challenge the status quo of the day by discussing topics like abortion, misogyny, child abuse, and what women really want in life. Such empathy was rare and hard to find in American Hollywood under the Hays Code. But as is the case with all art forms and movements in history, you either move with the times or you die. The 50s and 60s came and went. Films changed and so did audiences. Obstacles became more challenging, like the advent of television, and next a new generation of filmmakers who regarded filmmaking in a studio with artificial tools as outdated. Filmstaden and even some of its leading directors started to make movies away from the studio. And while it still exists for us to remember, the studio here was abandoned by the film industry. Does it seem meaningless?
Nej.
From Filmstaden, we immediately headed over to the Bio Fogo Blå Theater back in Korloplan to see a showing of The Wild Strawberries. What a privilege it was to see a Bergman film in the theater he visited as a child and meant so much to him as a director. They have a special Ingmar Bergman slot every Monday, so come by if you're ever in Stockholm then. One of the best things you can do in Stockholm is explore its parks, and Kungsholmen happens to have a lot of them. Riddarholmen may be one of the best places to go to find a place to relax and experience life as Stockholmers live it. The skate parks, beach volleyball, and street basketball courts, which were added in the 2000s, were always packed and full of families of all ages. But it's even more famous for its greenery. Keep walking along the path toward the water and you'll see why. The park was developed in the 1940s by city gardener Oswald Almqvist and architect Erik Lem, and designed to fit better into the original landscape without Swedish nature being tampered with. We came here every other day and soaked in the everyday life on the island. I've never seen so many birds of different types picking out at one time. They all look so happy. Keep walking along the adjacent promenade and you'll find restaurants, swimmers, and more beautiful views of the lake. If you are at all tired of this view, which I doubt, I'd suggest journeying over to the northwestern side of Kungsholmen and visiting Hornsberg Strand Parken, where you can go swimming in the lake, or you can go in a boat. If you're still not fed up with all the insanely magnificent views of the city, might I suggest a visit to Stockholm's Stadshuset, the city hall. Now, I actually didn't go until near the end of my trip and I missed the tour for the interior, but the outside is still well worth the trip. If you do get to go inside, I wouldn't miss the blue and gold banquet halls. Driving north of Stockholm, we arrive in Swedish Uppland, which is home to 1,196 runestones. 3 of the most famous runestones in the municipality of Broby are located here next to a private residence. They are classified as U135 through U137, and they were placed at the side of a road, only to be moved recently for their safety. Dating back to about 1020 to 1050 AD, they tell the story of Estrid and Östen, brought together by their families in a marriage alliance. As adults, they became successful traders and travelers, going as far as Jerusalem. Here is a family tree with them at the roots. What I found interesting was that the family tree here starts at the little roots of the family and ascends upward. U136 was made by Estrid, and it is her memorial to her husband's life and their shared achievements. The archaeological record tells us that early in Estrid and Östen's marriage, they had a child and that child died. This is Estrid's memorial to her son's life. U135 was made by their children, and it recognizes Östen's life and the bridge that they made in his honor. As you will see, runestones are the ways in which people living in the Viking Age told their stories and remembered their deeds. Each stone bears the image of a Christian cross, which means they were carved at a time when Estrid, Östen, and their children had converted to Christianity and were no longer pagan. Except U136 features the Maltese cross, which shows that they came into contact with other Christian cultures. More than 50 to 60 graves were found nearby who were members of their family clan and what is believed to be the foundations of Estrid and Östen's home. When a neighboring road was constructed at the start of 2000, the remains of a 63-year-old woman were found. Beside her were 3 boxes, one with coins from Basel, Switzerland, the Middle East, China, and even India. It is assumed that this is Estrid, since the woman was clearly rich and a trader. Time jump a generation later, and we're in the time of Estrid's grandson, Jarl Banka. Jarl Banka was the law here, and he built the causeway, which used to stretch down along the road. He commemorated his act by setting down 14 runestones, only 2 of which remain. It's important to note that these stones were often originally painted in bright colors. To properly date runestones, we examine a combination of elements. Square crosses, which signify a proclamation of conversion, dating the stone to at least the beginning of the mid-11th century when Sweden started to be Christian. Snakes are also a consistent motif on runestones and in all of Norse mythology. As you can see, the snake circles the stone in the same way that the great Midgard serpent in the Norse worldview encircles the world. The carver begins by carving the snake into the rock before carving the runes. The posture of the snake also matters, and the shape of the snake's eyes. In the Viking Age, the people living in this area met at assembly sites like this one to mete out justice and solve local disputes. This assembly site was created by the Skalhamra clan. The stones were the benches, and this was a site to adjudicate larger crimes, most of which would be handled with lex talionis, the payment of a fine in cattle, or a last resort, by forcing you to stand on a rock for 20 minutes.
smått för en stund får slippa jäkta och gå. Slå av på takten sin lite grann, det känns så hetsande hård ibland. Man vill ju leva lite dessemellan, med jobb och möda har man sin föda. Men man vill leva lite dessemellan, fast det är sällan som det blir bra. Man vill ju leva lite dessemellan, med jobb och möda har man sin föda. Men man vill leva lite dessemellan.
This is Sigtuna. Sigtuna is regarded as the oldest city in Sweden. It started to officially become the administrative capital here in the year 10,050 after the power base started to move away from Birka. About 400 people lived permanently in Sigtuna during the Viking Age, but several thousand would come at a time to trade. With a bay that was easy to protect from attack, prosperity endured here until approximately 1230, when Stockholm became the capital of Sweden. The houses were initially made of wood and then transitioned to stonework after Sigtuna's stone churches were constructed in the year 11,000. Perfect segue because we're now about to talk about Sigtuna's 3 church ruins. The Church of St. Olaf was constructed in the year 1100 and it's dedicated to St. Olaf of Norway, not to be confused with Olaf Tryggvason. It was quite humbling to walk into a church like this that's so old. Unfortunately, a lot of it inside is a restoration, but it gives you a good picture of what it might have looked like, and also the fact that at once upon a time, this church was both a church and a defensive fortification. Even here we can find traces of Viking runestones, many of which would later be used to build walls. Definitely visit Maria Kyrkan, St. Mary's Church, while you're here. It dates back to 1230 and was built by the Dominican friars. Unlike St. Olav's, Maria Kyrkan is still an active church today. The city would be deserted for several centuries after the center of power shifted to Stockholm, but Sigtuna experienced a significant revival in 1750. The old town hall, which would be established here in the central square in 1744, served as the office of the mayor and municipal court until 1947. Every week, the mayor and several councilmen would meet to discuss the maintenance of the town infrastructure and solve criminal cases. Speaking of criminals, prisoners would also be held here until the 1930s. Officially, not much has changed here in the last 1,000 years. The population remains small, with a record of about 10,000 people in 2020. Still, as Sweden's oldest town, it has quite a draw as far as tourism goes. We really didn't get to spend a long time here in Sigtuna, but I had a great experience at Bouldersbrod, a bakery shop. In fact, it might be my favorite bakery in all of Sweden. Welcome to Gamla Uppsala. Once a center of power and dominance, Uppsala is famous today for its massive burial mounds, many of which date back to both Viking Age Sweden, 800 AD, and even further back to the Vandal Age in 500 AD. Settlement began here in earnest 11,500 years ago, after the end of the Ice Age, and like at Birka, the water level was closer. By the 6th century, the inhabitants of this region were already building grave mounds as well as the terraced palaces from which Uppsala gets its name. Of the mounds raised both in the Vandal era and the Viking Age, 250 of the 3,000 remain. The three mounds here have always inspired great debate on who is buried below. Do they contain Viking kings or mythical kings and queens from whom Swedish kings are descended? Or were the very gods buried here? What we do know is that Old Uppsala became a ritual site. The grave mounds that we see here were carefully constructed. Diggers excavated from the sides prior to preparing the chamber for the burial. The dead person and his goods had to be laid in exactly the right fashion before the funerary pyre could be lit. Only after a few days could they reopen the chamber and arrange the dead person and the grave. Religious ceremonies were practiced here, such as the Disting, a festival that dates back to antiquity and was practiced in honor of Freya, the goddess of war, fertility, and magic, according to medieval Icelandic poet Snorri Sturluson. Adam of Bremen has something else to say. Chroniclers throughout the Christian world told stories about the happenings at Uppsala, but written sources on Viking rituals must be taken with a grain of salt, as they were written from a position of bias. We just don't know enough, even with the archaeological record. But we do know that at some point in the 1080s, Christianity officially began taking over in Sweden, and the temple disappeared. The sainted king Eric of Sweden was originally buried here in the year 1160 before being moved to the cathedral in Uppsala a century later. The church is also famous for being the burial site of Anders Celsius, the Swedish scientist and physicist from whom we gained the centigrade temperature scale. There is also the original painting of St. George fighting the dragon, what would later inspire the statue in Stockholm Cathedral. The final stop on the tour was Uppsala, and I had been super excited about our visit there. Beginning in the 13th century, Uppsala, or Östermalm as it was still called, overtook Gamla Uppsala as one of the pivotal centers of culture, with its famous cathedral, completed in 1435, and the prestigious Uppsala University in 1477. Uppsala University holds the privilege of being one of Sweden's most respected academic institutions. Uppsala Cathedral stands at a height of 118.7 meters, 389 feet tall, and is the tallest church in all of the Nordics. The interior reminds me very much of the Segovia Cathedral and how I felt there, of its efflorescent beauty and grandeur. You will find the resting place of several important individuals from Swedish history in the cathedral, such as Johan III of Sweden, Carl Linnaeus, the founder of modern taxonomy. There is also a beautiful memorial dedicated to UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. By far the grandest tomb belongs to Gustaf Wasa. The founder of Sweden's first royal dynasty is buried with 3 of his wives in a tomb commissioned by his son, Johan III. Only Gustaf Vasa's first 2 wives, both deceased, appear on the effigies. His 3rd wife survived him by 61 years. Even if the monarchy isn't your thing, you have to marvel at the size and splendor of the cathedral, the paintings on the walls dedicated to Gustaf Vasa's life and reign. There's something about the era of the Reformation that fascinates me. Despite all the violence, bloodshed, and hysteria, you can find similarities and also striking differences between the different countries, the problems they faced, most notably kings with the limits of absolute monarchy, and religious leaders struggling to redefine their sacred ideology. This leads us to this chapel. In the Filmstaden chapel, we can find the relics of St. Eric and St. Bridget, who predate the Reformation. One a righteous king and consolidator of laws who was slain by his foes here in Uppsala, and the other a noblewoman who chose to start a religious order dedicated to Christ through prayer and service. The future saint made a pilgrimage to Rome in 1349 and successfully appealed to the Pope. 600 years later, in 1989, Pope John Paul visited this cathedral and prayed in the chapel. If that doesn't evoke full circle, I don't know what will. We only had about 30 minutes to walk around outside, so I quickly stopped by the museum where Bergman filmed several iconic scenes from Fanny and Alexander. Crossing the bridge, I arrived at the Domtraphuset, located on St. Eriksgrund. The house dates back to the 13th century and is considered the oldest building in Uppsala. The staircase is known as the Judgment Stairs. A little about Bergman. His grandma lived in an apartment close by here in Uppsala. As a child, he frequently visited her, and those memories would come to life in his later films. Our brief tour ended with a quick photo stop outside the Uppsala castle. The castle was the site of the Stura murders in 5067, the declaration of war against the Holy Roman Empire during the 30 Years' War by Gustav Adolphus, and a fire in 1702 that burned the castle down. We were able to get a magnificent view of the cathedral and the Linnaean gardens nearby. I'd definitely like to return someday to check it out. On our last day in Stockholm, we visited the island of Djürgarden. Our first destination? The Wasa Museet. I figured that after ignoring it for the entire trip, I shouldn't leave Stockholm without having come to see this ship. And you know what? The Wasa doesn't disappoint. Commissioned for war, the Wasa was built in 2 years and was set to embark on its maiden voyage on August 10, 1628. But upon firing its salute and suffering a particular brutal gust of wind, the lowered gun decks were flooded and the ship capsized. The Wasa's disreputable end may have been the worst fiasco in Gustaf Adolphus's reign. Fortunately for us, the ship was discovered in 1956 after a long search by private researcher Anders Franzén. Diving down 40 meters at a temperature of 4 degrees Celsius 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and equipment weighing 100 kilos, the divers worked in low visibility in shifts of an hour each. With recreations and replicas, we get to see what the actual ship would have looked like. This model of the Wasa was made in the 80s and reflects the monumental research done on the vessel, and it was painted in 2008 after 2 decades of research on the painting of the Wasa had been completed. Besides the extremely beautiful imagery of regal lines in the Swedish royal coat of arms and Greco-Roman imagery, we can find simpler images that represent the king's subjects. While it isn't the largest museum, it is well worth coming here to see the ship from every single angle possible and learn the story, especially if you are a maritime enthusiast or a fan of the Pirates of the Caribbean. The photos don't do it justice whatsoever. For example, although you can't actually board the ship for obvious reasons, the exhibits more than compensate. The Wasa had 2 full gun decks and at full strength would have had 56 24-pounder cannons. 1 cannon, 1 ton. My next stop was Skansen, but first I had to stop by the nearby cemetery to pay my respects to the actor B.B. Andersson.
Fattar inte att världen blir vad vi gör den till!
Since its founding in 1891, the Skansen Open Air Museum has been committed to Swedish culture and heritage and presenting it to families and history enthusiasts alike. Tickets are cheap at about 285 Swedish krona, and every day is a new experience. See the street singers who are always on the move in the park. I was lucky to find them as soon as I walked up the escalator. As you walk deeper into this open museum, keep an eye out and see whatever interests you. Maybe a fika and some drinks at the Krog Tavern, for example. Visit Skansen's glass studio. This part of Skansen is dedicated to the province of Småland in southern Sweden. Glass has been manufactured here since the 18th century. Watch the magic happen, and then see all their creations in the shop. Haven't had enough of Småland? Step next door and marvel at their rich furniture making tradition. Fun fact, Småland is where IKEA and furniture designer Bruno Matheson come from. Oak, birch and elm are the most common type of wood used here in this museum. Like many of the other buildings in Skansen, the shop was relocated here from a furniture factory in Virserum, Småland. It had existed there since the 1930s. But how did Skansen start? Skansen was founded in 1891 by Arthur Hazelius as a site to remember Sweden's national heritage. Kyrkhusstugan, which has been here since the park's founding, comes from Blekinge and is a perfect example of Hazelius' original goals to portray Swedish farms and rustic living. Was it really like this? Probably not. Do I care? Also not. The objects in this farmstead that were all carefully chosen by Hazelius take me back to all the other living history museums I've visited through the years. My favorite objects were the baby's high chair and the stove connected to the fireplace. Today, Skansen tries to provide Swedes and tourists alike with a more complete picture of Sweden. This homestead was interesting because it focused on the history of education in Sweden. To increase literacy in the country, the Elementary School Act of 1842 decreed that every parish was required to establish at least one primary school. Who was to pay for it? The parish. The fact remained that many Swedish farmers couldn't send their children away to school. The farm required too much work. The 1840s saw a marked rise in newspapers as well, and ideas like freedom of the press and universal schooling. This was a bookbindery from the same period, and the bookbinding loom. Indentured servitude was notably not abolished in Sweden until 1945. Under the terms of indenture, farm laborers had to work at the estate. In return, they were assigned this cottage, rations, and a small plot of land for growing their crop. My favorite farm was the Alvras farmstead. During his visit to the far north of Sweden, Hazelius would have found farms like this one. The people who lived here would have committed their lives to hunting, fishing, trade, and the fashioning of ox hides into rope. This would have been the storeroom. And look at the size of this well. And this sauna would have been used for drying grain and meat. I highly recommend sitting inside for a mini concert. The interpreters are playing a slangpolska, a traditional dance from Sweden. The polska in each part of Sweden could be vastly different, and the traditions are passed down through the generations. This is a polska from Småland. Unfortunately, no dancing today, but I highly recommend checking out the Swedish movie Sunshine Follows the Rain from 1946. It's all about Sweden's rustic roots and love for song and dance. The icebox here is about 100 years old, and so is the cashier.
I know what it is. It's a washing machine.
I thought you were a washing machine.
Nej, men snälla far, that is not how you speak to your lady.
Well, I meant it as a compliment.
That's exactly how I heard it.
You are a machine.
Yeah.
Yes, but one can wonder what they were thinking. It's more like I received a problem than a gift, actually. I think I'm going to make a phone call.
I think yes.
Don't forget to smile.
85, 28, 22. Ja.
It's time for lunch, and I just want to say that at Skansen, there's not as much of a problem with crowds as there is in the rest of the world's theme parks. Most of all, not at Disney. At Wildman Deli, you can get smoked elk meat with pita bread and crushed potatoes. I ordered one and I liked it very much. The line for the Swedish cheesecakes looked promising, so I got one too. Hot and not very sweet, but also very tasty. Skansen is home to a large collection of animals, ones you'd find both at the farm and in the wild in the Nordics. This sleuth of bears were born at Skansen in 2020, and they are unbearably cute. After leaving the zoo area, we checked out some houses that would have been located in western Sweden, specifically the city of Värmland. This is a village hall from 1908, and it looks the same as it did in 1950. It would have been used for temperance meetings, fundraising campaigns, adult schooling, and union activities. Before leaving, check out the Skåne farmhouse. It came from the 1920s in southern Sweden, and it was owned by the Augustin family. The farmers rotated between growing crops and raising pigs, cattle for dairy products, and other animals. Wherever you go in Skansen, you're sure to find something exciting to see. I almost didn't come here, but I'm glad I did. From Skansen, I made my way back to Norrmalm to see the National Museum of Stockholm. This is Stockholm's premier art gallery. On the day that I visited, I had only 30 minutes to explore before closing time. I haven't checked out a museum with that kind of speed before, so welcome to the first time experience. How do we want to remember ourselves, and how do we want the world to see us? I loved how this museum really focused on this theme, whether we are seeing portraiture of kings and queens and their efforts to solidify their power and authority, or the more delicate efforts of individual artists leaving behind their mark on the canvas. After exiting the museum, I went on one last walk through the city, said goodbye to the Royal Palace, had a fika at Skepsbro Bakery, passed the Katarina elevator, and returned to Södermalm. Without knowing where I was going, I took these steps up to Mosebacke and Katarina Hill. On this little terrace, you will find a lovely view of the city. Only by climbing up to Mosebacke Torg can you understand why Södermalm is the hill town. One of Sweden's most important classical composers, Carl Michael Bellman, lived here. Mosebacke has been a center of culture and entertainment since the mid-19th century. The Söderteatern, the oldest theater in Stockholm, came dangerously close to being demolished before it was saved. In the 1950s, Ingmar Bergman stayed in a hotel room above the theater for 3 weeks, while writing the script for Sawdust and Tinsel. This tower used to be the Water Tower. Constructed in 1895 to 1897, it served the community until 1960. Wherever you go in Södermalm, you can find old and new houses, public parks. Heading south, we passed by St. Katarina's Church. In the mid-16th century, Johann III ordered a chapel to be built here to commemorate the murdered Stuart family. The population of Södermalm will spring up around this location, and in 1676, famous witch trials and witch burnings happened here. Parken is one of Södermalm's most beautiful parks. The Sophia Church, completed in 1906, sits at the top of the hill. There are also several well-preserved wooden cabins from the 18th century, which give you a good look at what Södermalm's architecture used to look like. A short ride away to the west side of the island and you can come to Lundgren Park. One of the best hidden gems of the city, this allotment was created in 1915 for growing food. It exists today as a closeted and a sustainable community, one that you're totally welcome to visit and take a walk through. Another positive is the view of the lake and Tantolstrand Bod, both of which are a short walk away. Our trip ended here at this beach, and I thank you all so much for following me